At my wife's funeral, my daughter ripped my grandson away from me. You should have died in her place. Goodbye forever, old man. Heartbroken, I went home and read my wife's last letter. If you're reading this, you need to know about our daughter. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The rain drummed against the funeral home windows like bullets hitting a tin roof. I stood there in my best black suit, the one Margaret had picked out for me 3 Christmases ago, watching as people filed past my wife's casket. 42 years of marriage, and now she was gone. Just like that. The cancer took her fast. Too fast. One day she was complaining about being tired. The next she was in the hospital with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks later, I was planning her funeral. I kept looking toward the entrance, waiting for Sarah to arrive. My daughter had barely spoken to me since Margaret's diagnosis, only showing up for hospital visits when absolutely necessary. Even then, she'd sit on the opposite side of the bed, holding her mother's hand while shooting me looks that could freeze hell over. When she finally walked in, my 8-year-old grandson Tommy clutched tight to her side. I felt my chest tighten. Sarah looked just like Margaret had at that age. Same auburn hair, same stubborn set to her jaw. Tommy was wearing a little black suit that was probably too big for him, his eyes wide and confused. "Daddy," he called out when he saw me, breaking free from Sarah's grip and running toward me with his arms outstretched. I knelt down and pulled him into a hug, breathing in that sweet smell of childhood, bubblegum, and innocence. "Hey there, buddy. I missed you." "I missed you too, Grandpa. Mommy said Grandma went to heaven. Is that true?" Before I could answer, Sarah was there, her face hard as stone. "Tommy, come here. Now." The boy looked between us, sensing the tension even at his age. Sarah's hand clamped down on his shoulder, and I saw him wince slightly. "Sarah, please," I said, standing up slowly. My knees weren't what they used to be. He just wanted to say hello to his grandfather. "Don't." Her voice was ice cold. "Just don't, Christian. Christian. Not Dad. Not even Father." She'd been calling me by my first name for months now, like I was some stranger she'd met on the street. The funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes, approached us carefully. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Parker, we're ready to begin the service whenever you are." Sarah nodded curtly. "We're ready." During the service, I sat in the front row while Sarah and Tommy sat 3 seats away from me. 3 seats that might as well have been 3 miles. I could hear Tommy asking his mother questions in whispers, but Sarah just shushed him every time. Pastor Williams spoke about Margaret's kindness, her volunteer work at the church, how she'd been a devoted wife and mother. I tried to focus on his words, but all I could think about was the empty space beside me where Margaret should have been sitting, probably whispering corrections about what the pastor got wrong about her life. After the service, people came up to offer their condolences. Margaret's sister, Helen, hugged me tight and whispered, "She loved you so much, Christian. Don't ever forget that." Our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, brought me a casserole and promised to check on me. Old friends from my construction days shook my hand and shared memories of backyard barbecues and birthday parties. But Sarah stood apart from it all, accepting brief hugs and murmured sympathies while keeping Tommy close to her side. Every time someone tried to include me in their conversation with her, she'd find an excuse to move away. The cemetery was worse. As they lowered Margaret's casket into the ground, Tommy started crying. Not the quiet tears of an adult, but the raw, confused sobs of a child who doesn't understand why his grandmother isn't coming home anymore. I moved toward him instinctively, wanting to comfort him, to hold him the way I'd held Sarah when she was small, and the world seemed too big and scary. "Tommy, it's okay," I said, reaching for him. "Grandpa's here." That's when Sarah exploded. "Get away from him!" she screamed, grabbing Tommy and pulling him against her so hard he stumbled. "Don't you dare touch my son!" Everyone at the graveside went silent. The pastor stopped mid-prayer. The funeral director looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground with the casket. "Sarah, what's wrong with you?" I asked, genuinely confused. "He's upset." "I just wanted to..." "You wanted to what? Comfort him?" Her laugh was harsh and bitter. "You didn't know how to take care of me. Don't touch my baby." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as everyone stared at us. Tommy was crying harder now, confused and scared by his mother's outburst. "You should have been the one in that casket," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with rage. "You should have died instead of her. She was the only good thing in our family, and now she's gone because she wasted her life taking care of you." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? In front of Margaret's grave, in front of our grandson, in front of everyone who'd come to pay their respects, my daughter had just told me I should be dead. "Until never again, you old man," she spat, then turned and walked away, carrying Tommy with her. I stood there watching them leave, Sarah's heels clicking against the cemetery path, Tommy looking back over her shoulder with tear-stained cheeks and confused eyes. He lifted his small hand in a little wave, and I waved back, even though my arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The other mourners began to disperse, offering me awkward pats on the shoulder and promises to call soon that we all knew they wouldn't keep. Mrs. Chen was the last to leave, pressing my hand and saying, "I'm sorry, Christian. I'm so sorry." I wasn't sure if she was sorry about Margaret or sorry about what Sarah had just done to me. Maybe both. When everyone was gone, I stood alone beside Margaret's grave. The groundskeepers waited respectfully at a distance, ready to finish filling in the hole that would be my wife's final resting place. "What did I do wrong, Maggie?" I whispered to the casket. "What did I do to make her hate me so much?" The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and gray, matching the weight in my chest. I'd lost my wife and my daughter in the same week. My grandson, the only family I had left, was being kept from me by a woman who seemed to blame me for everything wrong in the world. I drove home to our empty house, still smelling faintly of the flowers people had sent. The silence was deafening. For 42 years, this house had been filled with Margaret's voice, her laughter, her gentle humming while she cooked dinner. Now it was just me and the echo of Sarah's words. "You should have died instead of her." Maybe she was right. 3 days after the funeral, I was still wearing the same clothes I'd slept in. The house felt like a tomb, and I was its only occupant. I'd called in sick to my part-time job at the hardware store, though at 67, I barely needed the money anymore. It just gave me something to do, somewhere to go where people knew my name. The casseroles were piling up in the refrigerator, untouched. Mrs. Chen had knocked twice, but I'd pretended not to hear. Pastor Williams had called, but I'd let it go to the machine. I didn't want to talk to anyone. What was the point? The only people who mattered were gone or wanted nothing to do with me. I was sitting in Margaret's favorite chair, the blue recliner she'd bought at a garage sale 15 years ago, when I noticed the letter on the coffee table. It had my name written on it in Margaret's careful handwriting, the same script she'd used to address Christmas cards and write grocery lists for 42 years. My hand shook as I picked it up. The envelope was thick, like she'd written several pages. When had she written this? How long had it been sitting there? I tore it open carefully, not wanting to damage anything that had her touch on it. "My dearest Christian," it began, and I could hear her voice in those words, soft and patient, like she was sitting right beside me. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I imagine you're feeling lost and probably angry at the world. I know you, my love. You're probably wondering what you did to deserve losing me. And knowing our Sarah, she probably said some awful things at the funeral that are eating at you right now." I had to stop reading for a moment. Even in death, Margaret knew me better than I knew myself. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you years ago, but never found the courage. It's about Sarah, about why she's always been so distant with you, so angry. Christian, there's something about our daughter that you don't know, something we decided to keep from you because we thought it was for the best." My heart started beating faster. What secret had Margaret been keeping? What could be so important that she'd waited until after death to tell me? "Sarah isn't our biological daughter. We adopted her when she was 3 years old." The words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I read them again, then a third time, but they didn't change. "Do you remember that summer in 1987 when we'd been trying for so long to have a baby? We'd been to every doctor, tried every treatment, and nothing worked. You were working such long hours at the construction site, trying to save money for the fertility treatments. I was so lonely, Christian, and so desperate to be a mother. I remembered that summer, I'd taken every overtime shift I could get, working sometimes 16 hours a day. Margaret had seemed sad all the time, but I thought it was just the stress of trying to conceive. That's when I met Linda Morrison at the grocery store. You remember Linda? She worked at the county social services office. She told me about a little girl who needed a home whose parents had died in a car accident. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. She was 3 years old, Christian, and she had the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen. Morrison. Sarah's last name before we adopted her had been Morrison. How had I never put that together? I brought you to meet her without telling you what I was thinking. Do you remember? I said my friend Linda wanted us to meet this little girl she was caring for temporarily. You sat on the floor of that foster home and played blocks with her for 2 hours. She climbed into your lap and fell asleep, and you looked at me with such love in your eyes. I did remember. I remembered a little girl with tangled brown hair and a shy smile who'd warmed up to me faster than any kid ever had. I remembered thinking she looked like she could be ours. We brought her home a week later. The paperwork took months, but from that first day, she was ours. We never told her she was adopted because we wanted her to feel like she truly belonged. We thought it was better if she never knew she was different. The letter trembled in my hands. Sarah was adopted. Our Sarah, who'd been my little girl for 32 years, wasn't biologically mine. But children know things, Christian. They sense things we think we're hiding. Sarah always felt like something was missing, like she didn't quite fit. And I think deep down, she could tell that you treated her differently than you would have treated a biological child. Different? How had I treated her differently? You never meant to, my love. You tried so hard to be a good father to her. But there was always a distance there, a hesitation. When she'd climb into your lap, you'd stiffen just slightly. When she wanted to play, you'd suggest she ask Mommy instead. When she drew pictures for you, you'd smile and put them on the refrigerator, but not with the same joy you showed when the neighbors' kids brought their biological fathers their artwork. I thought back to Sarah's childhood, trying to remember. Had I really been that distant, that different with her? She could feel it, Christian. Children always can. She grew up thinking there was something wrong with her, something that made her unlovable to you. I tried to compensate by giving her extra attention, extra affection, but it wasn't enough. She needed her father to love her unconditionally, and she never felt like you did. The words were like knives in my chest. I'd tried to be a good father. I'd worked hard to provide for her, taken her to school, helped with homework, taught her to ride a bike. But had I ever really let myself love her the way I would have loved a biological child? As she got older, the distance grew worse. You'd make comments about how she didn't look like us, how her personality was so different from ours. You meant them as observations, but to Sarah, they felt like accusations, like you were pointing out that she didn't belong. I remembered saying things like that. She's got spirit, this one. Wonder where she gets it from. I'd said it with a smile, but now I realized how it must have sounded to a child who was already insecure about her place in our family. When she was 16 and acting out, you'd say things like, "I don't know where this attitude comes from," or "This isn't how we raised her." You were frustrated, like any parent would be, but Sarah heard those words as confirmation that she was fundamentally different, fundamentally wrong. The memories came flooding back now. Sarah's teenage years had been difficult. She'd been moody, rebellious, argumentative. I'd handled it the way my own father had handled my teenage rebellion, with stern discipline and little patience for what I saw as disrespect. She tried so hard to win your approval, Christian. Do you remember her senior year when she took that advanced math class she hated, just because you'd mentioned that engineering was a good career? Or when she joined the softball team because you'd played baseball in high school? She was trying to find something, anything, that would make you look at her the way fathers look at their daughters. I did remember those things, but I'd seen them as phases, not desperate attempts to connect with me. But you never seemed to notice her efforts. You'd nod and say, "That's nice, honey," when she'd tell you about her achievements. You came to a few games, but you never cheered the way other fathers did. You were proud of her, I know you were, but you never showed it. Not really. Margaret was right. I'd been proud of Sarah, but I'd also been careful not to get too attached. Looking back now, I could see that I'd been protecting myself. What if she decided she wanted to find her real parents? What if she left us? What if I loved her completely and then lost her? The worst part was when she started dating Tommy's father. You liked Mark immediately, said he reminded you of yourself at that age. But when Sarah brought him home, you'd talk to him more than you talked to her. You'd bond with him over sports and work, and Sarah would just sit there watching, feeling invisible in her own home. I remembered Mark. Good kid, responsible, polite. I had liked him. But had I really paid more attention to him than to Sarah? When they got married, Sarah was so happy that you walked her down the aisle. She told me it was the first time she felt like you were truly proud to be her father. But even then, in your speech at the reception, you talked more about what a good man Mark was than about what a wonderful daughter Sarah was. The wedding. I'd been so nervous about speaking in front of all those people that I'd rehearsed the same safe speech over and over. Something about gaining a son and keeping a daughter. Generic words that could have applied to anyone. After Tommy was born, Sarah hoped things would change. She thought maybe having a grandchild would help you bond with her, help you see her as truly family. But you did the same thing with Tommy that you'd done with her. You loved him, but carefully, at a distance. Sarah watched you with him and saw the same hesitation, the same holding back. Tommy, my grandson who called me Grandpa and hugged me tight and drew me pictures that I put on my refrigerator. But had I been distant with him too? Had I been repeating the same pattern? When Mark died in that accident 2 years ago, Sarah needed her father. She needed you to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But you didn't know how. You brought casseroles and offered to help with practical things, but you never just sat with her and let her cry. You never told her you loved her unconditionally. Mark's death had been sudden. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit his car on his way home from work. Sarah had been devastated, and I'd felt helpless watching her grieve. I'd tried to help in the ways I knew how, but apparently that hadn't been enough. She's angry at you, Christian, but not for the reasons you think. She's not angry because you weren't a perfect father. She's angry because she spent 32 years trying to earn a love that you were always holding back. She's angry because she never felt like she was truly yours. The letter was getting blurry through my tears, but I kept reading. I know this isn't easy to hear, my love. You're a good man, Christian Parker. You worked hard. You provided for us. You never raised your voice or laid a hand on either of us in anger. But Sarah needed more than that. She needed to feel chosen, not just accepted. She needed to feel like your daughter, not like a child you were obligated to care for. I set the letter down and put my head in my hands. 32 years of holding back, of protecting myself, of treating my daughter like she was temporary. But there was more. There's something else you need to know. Sarah suspects the truth. She's always suspected it. A few months ago, she asked me directly if she was adopted. I couldn't lie to her anymore, Christian. I told her the truth. Sarah knew. She'd known for months that she was adopted, and I'd been completely oblivious. She cried for hours that day, not because she was adopted, but because she finally understood why you'd never fully accepted her. She said it explained everything. Why you'd always seemed like you were waiting for her to leave. Why you'd never fought for her the way fathers fight for their daughters. But here's what you need to understand, my darling husband. Sarah doesn't want to know about her biological parents. She doesn't want to find her real family. You and I are her real family. We're the ones who raised her, who loved her, who were there for every skinned knee and broken heart. The problem was never that she was adopted. The problem was that you never let yourself believe she was truly yours. I picked up the letter again, my hand steadier now. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that it's not too late. Sarah is angry right now, and she's grieving, and she's probably said terrible things to you. But underneath all that anger is a little girl who just wants her daddy to love her completely. She wants to know that you choose her, that you're proud of her, that you would fight for her. The letter was almost over. She needs you, Christian, and Tommy needs his grandfather. Not the careful, distant version of yourself you've been showing them, but the real you. The man who taught Sarah to ride a bike even though she wasn't your biological child. The man who stayed up all night when she had pneumonia at age 5. The man who cried at her high school graduation even though you tried to hide it. Had I cried at her graduation? I tried to remember, but everything from those years seemed hazy now. Don't let pride keep you from your family, my love. Don't let fear of being hurt keep you from fighting for your daughter. She's worth fighting for. She's always been worth fighting for. The letter was signed simply, "All my love forever, Margaret." I sat there in the silence of our empty house, holding the letter and understanding for the first time why my daughter hated me. Not because I'd been a bad father, but because I'd been a careful one. Because I'd loved her with conditions, with reservations, with the constant fear that she wasn't really mine to lose. Sarah was adopted. The little girl who'd fallen asleep in my lap 32 years ago, who'd called me daddy and drawn me pictures and tried so hard to make me proud, had spent her entire life feeling like she wasn't good enough to be truly loved by me. And now Margaret was gone, and Sarah thought I should have died instead. Maybe it wasn't too late to show her she was wrong. I spent the next week going through old photo albums, seeing everything with new eyes. Every picture told a different story now that I knew the truth. There was 3-year-old Sarah on her first day with us, clutching a stuffed rabbit and looking lost in our living room. I remembered that day now, how small she'd seemed, how quiet. Margaret had bought her new clothes, but Sarah had insisted on wearing this tattered yellow dress that must have belonged to her before. I'd suggested we throw it away, get her something fresh for her new life. But Margaret had insisted we keep it, understanding even then that Sarah needed something from her past. Looking at the photo now, I could see the uncertainty in her little face. She was trying to smile, but her eyes were wary, like she was waiting for us to change our minds and send her back. In the next album, there she was at 4 years old on Christmas morning. She was holding up a doll I'd picked out, but she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at me, studying my face like she was trying to read whether I was happy with her reaction. Even at 4, she was performing for my approval. I turned the page and found a picture that made my chest tight. Sarah at 5, standing next to me at a father-daughter dance at her school. She was wearing a pink dress with ribbons in her hair, beaming up at me. But I was looking off to the side, distracted by something I couldn't even remember now. My hand was on her shoulder, but it looked more like an obligation than affection. How many times had I done that? Been physically present but emotionally distant. I found another photo from that same year, Sarah's kindergarten graduation. She was on stage with her class, and I could see Margaret in the audience clapping and smiling. But where was I? I searched through several photos from that day before finding one where I was visible in the background checking my watch. I'd been there, but I hadn't been present. Not really. The memories started coming back in painful detail. Sarah at 6, bringing me a drawing she'd made of our family. Me, Margaret, and her, all holding hands in front of our house. I'd glanced at it, told her it was nice, and stuck it on the refrigerator without really looking. When I'd cleaned out the refrigerator last week, I'd found that same drawing, faded and forgotten behind newer papers. But I remembered now how her face had fallen when I'd barely looked at it, how she'd stood there for a moment, waiting for more of a reaction, before quietly walking away. At 7, she'd started playing Little League softball. Margaret had signed her up, but I'd been the one to take her to practice because Margaret was working late shifts at the hospital then. I'd sit in the bleachers reading the newspaper while she played, occasionally glancing up when other parents cheered. I found photos from one of her games, Sarah running to first base, her face determined and serious. In the background, I could see other fathers on their feet, shouting encouragement. But there I was, sitting calmly, not even watching the play. After one game, she'd run up to me, grass stains on her uniform and dirt on her face. "Did you see my hit, Daddy? Did you see how far it went?" I'd nodded and said something like, "Good job, kiddo," without much enthusiasm. I'd been thinking about work, about a problem with the foundation we were pouring the next day. Sarah had waited a moment, like she was hoping for more, then quietly gathered her equipment. At 8, she'd brought home a report card with all A's. Margaret had made a big fuss, hung it on the refrigerator, called her mother to brag. I'd looked at it and said, "That's what we expect from you, Sarah. Keep it up." That's what we expect, not "I'm proud of you" or "This is amazing." Oh, just an expectation met, nothing more. I found a photo from her 9th birthday party. She'd wanted a horse-themed party, and Margaret had gone all out with decorations and a horse-shaped cake. In the picture, Sarah was blowing out her candles, and Margaret was right beside her, helping and laughing. I was there too, but standing back, arms crossed, looking like I was supervising rather than celebrating. That was the year she'd asked for riding lessons. "All my friends take riding lessons, Daddy. Could I try it, please?" I'd said it was too expensive, too dangerous, too much trouble to drive her to the stable every week. Margaret had looked disappointed, but she'd backed me up, like she always did. Sarah had nodded and said, "Okay, Daddy," in that quiet voice she used when she was trying not to show she was hurt. 6 months later, I'd spent $800 on a new fishing boat. Sarah had been there when I'd written the check, and I'd seen her face when she realized how much I was spending on something for myself after telling her riding lessons cost too much. At 10, she'd joined the school choir. Margaret and I had gone to her first concert, and Sarah had been so excited to see us in the audience. She'd waved from the stage when she spotted us, and Margaret had waved back enthusiastically. I'd given a small nod, worried about looking foolish. After the concert, Sarah had run up to us, her face glowing with excitement. "Did you like it? Did I sound okay?" Margaret had hugged her and told her she was wonderful, that she was so proud. I'd said, "You did fine," and started walking toward the exit, ready to go home. Fine. I'd told my daughter she'd done fine when she'd just sung her heart out in front of 200 people. By 11, Sarah had stopped asking me to her school events. She'd tell Margaret, and Margaret would tell me, and I'd show up if I could. But Sarah had stopped looking for me in the audience, stopped running to me afterward for approval. I'd told myself she was becoming more independent, more mature. I hadn't realized she was giving up on me. At 12, she'd started her period, and Margaret had handled all of that. I'd been relieved not to have to deal with it, not to have awkward conversations about things I didn't understand. But when Margaret had suggested I take Sarah shopping for a special dinner to mark her becoming a young woman, I'd said that was women's stuff and left it to Margaret. How many times had I labeled things as women's stuff to avoid having to engage with my daughter's life? 13 was when the real distance started. Sarah became moody, argumentative, typical teenager behavior. But instead of seeing it as normal adolescent development, I'd taken it personally. When she'd rolled her eyes at something I'd said, I'd gotten angry. When she'd argued about her curfew, I'd laid down the law without discussion. "I don't know where this attitude is coming from," I'd said to Margaret more than once. "This isn't how we raised her. This isn't how we raised her." As if she was defective somehow, as if her personality was a problem to be solved rather than a part of who she was. I found a photo from her 13th birthday. She was sitting at our kitchen table, looking at a cake Margaret had made, but she wasn't smiling. Margaret was trying to get her to pose for the camera, but Sarah looked miserable. I was in the background, standing in the doorway like I was just passing through rather than participating in my daughter's birthday. That was the year she'd asked if she could redecorate her room. She'd wanted to paint it purple and put up posters of her favorite bands. I'd said absolutely not. We weren't going to let her turn her room into some teenage disaster zone. "But it's my room," she'd argued. "Why can't I make it look how I want?" "Because you're 13 years old and you don't make decisions about our house," I'd replied. "When you have your own house, you can paint it whatever color you want." She'd stared at me for a long moment, and I'd seen something die in her eyes, some hope or expectation that had finally been extinguished. Margaret had tried to mediate, suggesting we compromise on the color, maybe let Sarah choose new bedding, but the damage was done. Sarah had retreated to her plain white room and stopped asking for things. At 14, she'd made the honor roll every semester, but I'd stopped making a big deal about it. Good grades were expected, not celebrated. She'd played varsity softball as a freshman, but I'd only made it to 2 games all season. Work was busy, I'd told myself. But the truth was, I'd felt awkward sitting in those bleachers with the other parents, like I was pretending to be something I wasn't. 15 was when she'd started dating a nice kid named David who was polite and respectful when he came to pick her up. I'd grilled him about his intentions, made jokes about cleaning my shotgun, done all the things fathers are supposed to do, but with Sarah, I'd barely acknowledged that she was growing up, becoming a young woman. When she'd asked if she could go to prom, I'd focused on the cost of the dress, the late hours, the potential for trouble. Margaret had handled all the shopping and planning while I'd complained about teenagers and their expensive parties. Looking back now, I could see that Sarah had stopped including me in her excitement about anything. She'd talked to Margaret about boys and friends and dreams for the future, but with me, conversations stayed surface level: weather, school, chores. At 16, she'd gotten her license, and I'd been the one to teach her to drive. It should have been a bonding experience, father and daughter learning this rite of passage together. Instead, I'd been impatient and critical, focused on her mistakes rather than her progress. Pay attention, Sarah. Check your mirrors. Slow down at this intersection. I'd treated it like a driving lesson, not like time with my daughter. When she'd finally passed her test, she'd hugged Margaret first, then given me a polite, "Thanks for teaching me, Dad," like I was an instructor she'd hired. 17 was her senior year, when she'd taken that advanced calculus class she'd struggled with. I'd found her at the kitchen table night after night, surrounded by textbooks and looking frustrated. "Maybe you should drop it," I'd suggested. "Focus on classes you're good at." Margaret had shot me a look, and later that night she'd explained that Sarah was taking the class because she thought I'd be proud of her for challenging herself academically. "She's trying to impress you, Christian. She thinks you want her to be good at math and science like you were." But I'd never told Sarah I was proud of her effort. I'd just seen her struggling and suggested she quit. At 18, graduation day, Sarah had been valedictorian, giving a speech about overcoming obstacles and never giving up on your dreams. She'd looked beautiful in her cap and gown, confident and accomplished. Margaret had cried during the speech. I'd felt proud too, but I'd shown it by nodding approvingly and patting Sarah's shoulder afterward. "Good job," I'd said. "You worked hard for this. Good job." Like she'd completed a task rather than achieved something remarkable. That night, at her graduation party, I'd overheard her talking to one of her friends. "My mom's been crying all day," Sarah had said, laughing. "She's so emotional about everything. My dad's just glad I'm not his responsibility anymore." The friend had laughed, but I'd heard the pain underneath Sarah's joke. She'd been 18 years old and already believed I couldn't wait to be done with her. Maybe she was right. Maybe part of me had been relieved that she was grown up, that I'd successfully gotten her to adulthood without anything terrible happening. Maybe I'd been counting down the days until I could stop worrying about saying or doing the wrong thing with someone else's child. Because that's what I'd always thought of her as, wasn't it? Someone else's child, who had been entrusted to my care temporarily. I closed the photo album and sat back in Margaret's chair, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. 32 years of moments, 32 years of opportunities to show Sarah she was loved unconditionally, and I'd missed almost every one. I'd been so afraid of getting too attached to a child who might leave that I'd never allowed myself to be the father she needed. I'd been so worried about protecting myself that I'd failed to protect her from feeling unwanted in her own home. No wonder she hated me. No wonder she thought I should have died instead of Margaret. The worst part was that I had loved her. I'd loved her from that first day when she'd fallen asleep in my lap at the foster home. But I'd loved her carefully, conditionally, with the constant awareness that she wasn't really mine, except she had been mine. For 32 years, she'd been my daughter, and I'd wasted every single day of it. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to work and drove to the county courthouse. If Sarah was adopted, there would be records. There would be a paper trail that might help me understand not just where she came from, but who she really was. The clerk at the records office was a young woman with kind eyes who looked at me with sympathy when I explained what I was looking for. "Adoption records from the 1980s are mostly sealed," she said gently. "But if you have the original name and approximate dates, I might be able to find something in the public records." Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I told her. Born in 1984, adopted by us in 1987. She disappeared into the back room for what felt like hours. When she returned, she was carrying a thin file folder. "There's not much here that isn't confidential," she said, "but I can tell you that Sarah Morrison's parents were James and Linda Morrison. They died in a car accident in March of 1987. There's also a reference to a surviving grandmother, but no contact information. James and Linda Morrison." Sarah's biological parents had names, faces, lives that had been cut short when she was just 3 years old. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Any way to find out more about them?" The clerk hesitated. "You might try the newspaper archives. The accident would have been reported, and sometimes they include family information in the obituaries." I spent the rest of the day at the public library, scrolling through microfilm of old newspapers. The accident had been front-page news in the small town where Sarah's biological parents had lived. A drunk driver had run a red light and hit their car head-on. They'd died instantly. Sarah had been at home with a babysitter. The obituary was heartbreaking. James Morrison, 26, worked at the local bank. Linda Morrison, 24, was a kindergarten teacher. They were described as devoted parents who loved camping and volunteering at their church. They were survived by their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah and Linda's mother, Rose Henderson. Rose Henderson, Sarah's biological grandmother. I wrote down the name and started searching. Rose Henderson would be in her 70s now, if she was still alive. After several hours of research, I found an address in a retirement community about 2 hours away. I sat in my car outside the Sunset Manor Assisted Living Facility for 30 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. What was I going to say? "Hello, I'm the man who adopted your granddaughter 32 years ago, and she hates me." But something Margaret had written in her letter kept echoing in my mind. Sarah needed to know she was chosen, not just accepted. Maybe understanding her history, knowing about the people who had loved her before us, would help her feel more complete. Rose Henderson was in the community room, working on a jigsaw puzzle with 2 other residents. She was small and delicate, with silver hair and bright blue eyes. When I introduced myself, her face went pale. "Sarah?" she whispered. "You adopted Sarah? My Sarah?" I nodded, and she started crying immediately. "I tried to find her," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "After the accident, they told me she'd been placed in a good home, but they wouldn't tell me where. I tried for years to get information, but they said it was better for her to have a fresh start." Rose led me to her small apartment where the walls were covered with photographs, but mixed in with pictures of her friends and other family members were several photos of a young couple with a little girl who looked exactly like Sarah. "That's my Linda and her husband James," Rose said, pointing to a wedding photo. "And that's Sarah when she was 2. The resemblance was startling. Sarah looked exactly like her biological mother, the same auburn hair, the same stubborn chin, the same bright smile. "Tell me about them," I said. "Tell me about Sarah's parents." Rose's face lit up. Oh, they were wonderful. Linda was such a gentle soul, always helping others. She taught kindergarten, and she loved it so much. She'd come home every day with stories about her students. James was quieter, but he adored Linda and Sarah. He'd built Sarah this elaborate playhouse in their backyard, spent every weekend working on it. She showed me more photos, Sarah's biological parents pushing her on a swing, reading her bedtime stories, teaching her to blow dandelions in their yard. Sarah was such a happy little girl, Rose continued, always singing, always laughing. Linda used to say she was like a little sunbeam, brightening up every room she entered. A sunbeam. I tried to remember if I'd ever thought of Sarah that way, if I'd ever seen her joy as something to celebrate rather than just childish energy to be contained. After the accident, Sarah came to stay with me for a few weeks, Rose said, her voice growing sad. But I was 68 years old and not in good health. I wanted to keep her, but I knew I couldn't give her what she needed. When Linda's friend from social services found you and your wife, it seemed like a blessing. Linda's friend from social services. That must have been Linda Morrison, the woman Margaret had mentioned in her letter. What was Sarah like during those weeks with you? I asked. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Broken, confused. She kept asking when Mommy and Daddy were coming home. She'd sit by the window for hours, watching for their car. It broke my heart. Yeah, I thought about 3-year-old Sarah, traumatized and grieving, being placed with strangers who thought they were giving her a better life. No wonder she'd been cautious, careful not to get too attached. Did she ever ask about us? About her adoptive family? Rose nodded. In the early years, yes. I'd call social services every few months, asking if they could tell me how she was doing. They said she was healthy and happy, that she'd adjusted well to her new family. But they wouldn't give me any details. You never tried to contact her directly? I thought about it every day, Rose said, but they'd told me it was better for her to have a clean break, to not be confused by contact with her past. I thought maybe they were right. Maybe it was better if she could just be your daughter and not have to carry the weight of losing her first family. I understood that logic. Margaret and I had made the same choice, thinking we were protecting Sarah from pain. But maybe we'd all been wrong. Maybe Sarah had needed to know about the people who had loved her first, who had grieved for her, who had never forgotten her. Would you like to see her again? I asked. If I could arrange it? Rose's face crumpled. More than anything in the world. I've missed 32 years of her life. I don't even know what she looks like now, if she got married, if she has children. She has a son, I said. Tommy. He's 8 years old. A great-grandson, Rose whispered, fresh tears flowing. I have a great-grandson. I spent the next 2 hours listening to Rose tell me stories about Sarah's biological parents, about their short but happy marriage, about how much they'd loved their little girl. She showed me a box of things she'd saved from their house, photos, some of Sarah's baby clothes, a few toys. I always hoped I'd be able to give these to her someday, Rose said, touching a small stuffed elephant that had obviously been well loved. This was her favorite. She called him Peanut and took him everywhere. The elephant looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. As I was preparing to leave, Rose grabbed my arm. Please, she said. I know I have no right to ask, but if there's any way you could let her know about me, let her know I never stopped loving her. I promised I would try. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what Rose had told me. Sarah came from people who had loved her deeply, who had been devoted parents in the short time they'd had with her. She wasn't just an abandoned child who had needed rescuing. She was a little girl who had been cherished and then lost everything. Maybe that's why she'd always seemed to be waiting for the other shoe to drop, why she'd never fully trusted that Margaret and I would love her forever. She'd already learned that people you love can disappear without warning. When I got home, I went up to the attic and started going through boxes of Sarah's childhood things that Margaret had saved. Clothes, school projects, report cards, all the artifacts of a childhood that I'd participated in, but never fully embraced. In one of the boxes, I found something that made my breath catch. A small stuffed elephant, worn and faded, missing one eye. Peanut. Somehow, Sarah had managed to keep her beloved toy from her life before us. Margaret must have known. She must have realized what it was, and made sure it stayed with Sarah even as she outgrew other toys. But Sarah had never told me about it, never shared that connection to her past. How many other pieces of her original self had she hidden from me over the years? I found something else in the box, a journal Sarah had kept when she was 16. I almost didn't read it, feeling like I was violating her privacy. But she was 35 years old now, and I desperately needed to understand what I'd missed. The entries were typical teenage thoughts mostly, complaints about school, excitement about boys, frustration with Margaret and me. But scattered throughout were entries that made my chest tight. Had another dream about my real parents last night. I wonder if they would have understood me better, if they would have been proud of the things I'm proud of. Dad barely looked at my report card today. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers I exist. Mom tried to get Dad to come to my softball game, but he said he was too busy. I'm starting to think he just doesn't want to be there. I know I'm adopted. I've always known, somehow. But I can't ask them about it because what if they decide they don't want me anymore? What if knowing that I know makes them realize they made a mistake? That last entry was dated just 6 months before her 18th birthday. She'd known for years and had been too afraid to ask us about it, too afraid that acknowledging the truth would give us an excuse to let her go. I closed the journal and sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of my daughter's childhood, finally understanding the depth of my failure. Sarah hadn't just needed a father, she'd needed someone to help her process the trauma of losing her first parents, someone to honor the love they'd had for her while building new love in our family. She'd needed someone to tell her that being adopted didn't make her less valuable, less worthy of unconditional love. Instead, I'd given her a home, but withheld my heart. I'd provided for her, but never made her feel truly chosen. But now I had something I could give her. I had Rose, her biological grandmother, who had never stopped loving her. I had stories about James and Linda Morrison, about how much they'd adored their little girl. I had Peanut the elephant, and a box of memories that proved she'd been wanted and loved from the very beginning. Maybe it wasn't too late to show Sarah that she wasn't just accepted in our family, she was treasured. Maybe I could finally give her the one thing she'd always needed, the knowledge that she'd always been worthy of love, from the day she was born until now. The question was whether she'd let me try. I stood on Sarah's front porch for 10 minutes before I found the courage to ring the doorbell. In my hands, I carried a small box containing Peanut the elephant, photos of her biological parents, and copies of the newspaper articles about the accident. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might give out. When Sarah answered the door, her face immediately hardened. She was wearing jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, and I could hear Tommy's voice from somewhere inside the house. "What do you want?" she asked, not opening the screen door. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Please, Sarah, it's important." "We have nothing to talk about." She started to close the door, but I held up the box. "It's about your adoption," I said quickly. "About your biological parents." She froze, her hand still on the door handle. For a moment, neither of us moved. "You know," she said finally, "it wasn't a question. Your mother told me in a letter she left for me to read after the funeral." Sarah's jaw clenched. "Of course she did. Even in death, she's trying to fix your mistakes." The word stung, but I pushed forward. "Can I come in, please? Tommy doesn't need to hear this conversation." She hesitated, then stepped back to let me inside. The house was warm and lived in, with Tommy's drawings on the refrigerator and toys scattered around the living room. It felt like a real home in a way our house had never quite managed. "Tommy's in his room playing video games," Sarah said, leading me to the kitchen table. "You have 10 minutes. I set the box on the table and took a deep breath. "I found your biological grandmother. She's alive, Sarah. She's been looking for you for 32 years. Sarah's face went white. She sank into a chair, staring at the box like it might explode. "Her name is Rose Henderson," I continued. "She's your mother's mother. She lives in a retirement home about 2 hours from here." "My mother's mother?" Sarah repeated softly. "What was my mother's name?" "Linda. Linda Morrison. Your father was James Morrison. They died in a car accident when you were 3. Tears started flowing down Sarah's cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. I reached into the box and pulled out one of the photos Rose had given me. Sarah's biological parents on their wedding day, young and radiant, and so obviously in love. Sarah picked up the photo with trembling hands. "She looks like me," she whispered. "You're the image of her," I said. "Rose says you have her smile, her stubborn chin. She also says you are a happy little girl, always singing, always laughing." "I don't remember them," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I don't remember anything from before I came to live with you. You were only 3. That's normal." I pulled out another photo, this one of Sarah as a toddler, sitting in her father's lap while he read her a story. "But they loved you so much, Sarah. Rose has dozens of photos, hundreds of stories. You weren't unwanted or abandoned. You were cherished." Sarah held the photo closer, studying her biological father's face. "What were they like?" I spent the next several minutes telling her everything Rose had shared with me. How Linda was a kindergarten teacher who adored children. How James worked at the bank but spent every weekend building Sarah a playhouse in their backyard. How they'd planned to have more children, to give Sarah siblings. "They sound wonderful," Sarah said when I finished. "They sound like the kind of parents who would have understood me." The accusation in her voice was clear, but I didn't defend myself. Not yet. There's something else, I said, reaching into the box one more time. I pulled out Peanut the elephant, worn and faded, but still recognizable. Sarah gasped and reached for him immediately. "Peanut," she whispered, clutching the stuffed animal to her chest. "Oh my God, Peanut, I thought I'd lost him." "You've had him all along," I said gently. "Your mother, Margaret, she knew what he was. She made sure you kept him, even when you outgrew other toys." Sarah was crying harder now, holding the elephant like a lifeline. "I used to have dreams about him when I was little. Dreams about an elephant who lived in a beautiful house with people who loved me. I thought I'd made him up." "You didn't make anything up. Those were memories, Sarah. Real memories of people who loved you completely." We sat in silence for several minutes while Sarah held Peanut and looked through the photos. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Why are you showing me this now? Why didn't you tell me years ago?" This was the moment I'd been dreading, but also the moment that mattered most. I had to tell her the truth, even if it meant admitting to 32 years of failure. "Because I was afraid," I said simply. "I was afraid that if you knew about your biological parents, you'd realize that we weren't good enough, that you'd want to leave us and find your real family." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. "We were never your real family, were we? Not to you." The question hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah, be honest," she said firmly. "For once in your life, be completely honest with me. Did you ever really think of me as your daughter?" I took a shaky breath. "No," I admitted. "I loved you, but I always held back. I always thought of you as someone we were taking care of temporarily, someone who might leave us at any moment." Sarah nodded like she'd expected this answer. "I knew it. I've always known it. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up feeling like you're on trial? Like you have to earn the right to be loved every single day?" "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I failed you in every way that mattered." "Yes, you did." Her voice was cold, matter of fact. "Do you know what I used to think when I was little? I used to think that if I was just good enough, smart enough, quiet enough, you'd finally love me the way you were supposed to. I spent my entire childhood trying to be perfect so you wouldn't send me back." The words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. "When I got married," Sarah continued, "I was so happy when you walked me down the aisle. I thought maybe finally you were proud to be my father. But even in your speech at the reception, you talked more about Mark than about me. I was 30 years old and I was still waiting for you to choose me." I remembered that speech. Generic words about gaining a son, keeping a daughter, safe words that didn't risk revealing too much emotion. "And when Tommy was born," Sarah's voice broke again, "I thought maybe having a grandchild would change things. Maybe you'd love him the way you never loved me. But you did the same thing with him that you did with me. You held back, you were careful. You treated him like he might disappear at any moment too." "I didn't want to get hurt," I said quietly. "I didn't want to love too much and then lose everything. So instead, you chose to hurt us." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Do you know what Tommy asked me last week? He asked if Grandpa Christian doesn't like him very much because you never hug him tight or play with him the way his friends' grandfathers do." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Tommy, my innocent grandson, had already started to feel the same distance I'd put between myself and Sarah. I was repeating the pattern, I whispered, more to myself than to her. "Yes, you were. And that's why I said what I said at the funeral. Because I couldn't watch you do to my son what you did to me. I couldn't let him grow up feeling like he wasn't good enough for his grandfather's love." We sat in silence again, the weight of 32 years of mistakes hanging between us. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Why now? Why are you telling me all this now? Mom's been dead for 2 weeks. Where was this honesty when she was alive? Where was this effort when it might have made a difference?" "Because I'm 67 years old," I said, "and I just realized I've wasted the most important relationship in my life. Because Tommy is 8 years old, and I don't want to waste his childhood the way I wasted yours." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And because," I continued, my voice getting stronger, "Margaret's letter made me realize that you don't need me to love you carefully anymore. You need me to love you completely, the way I should have from the beginning, the way your biological parents would have if they'd lived. But they didn't live, Sarah said quietly. They died, and I got stuck with parents who treated me like a foster child for 32 years. You're right, I said. But Rose is still alive. She wants to meet you, Sarah. She wants to meet her granddaughter and her great-grandson. She has stories about your parents, more photos, things they saved for you. Sarah clutched Peanut tighter. What if she doesn't like who I've become? What if I'm not what she's been hoping for all these years? For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw the scared little girl underneath the angry woman. The 3-year-old who had lost everything and spent the rest of her life afraid it would happen again. She's going to love you, I said with complete certainty. Because you're Linda's daughter, and Linda was the light of her life. Because you're strong and beautiful, and you've survived things that would have broken other people. Because you're an amazing mother who's protecting her son the way I should have protected you. Sarah started crying again, but these tears seemed different, softer somehow. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I meet her, and it just makes everything hurt worse? What if knowing what I lost makes it impossible to live with what I have? Then you'll deal with it, I said, and you won't deal with it alone. I'll help you if you let me. She looked at me skeptically. Why would you help me? You've never helped me with anything emotional in your entire life. Because I want to be the father you deserved, I said. I know it's probably too late, but I want to try. I want to learn how to love you the way you needed to be loved. Sarah was quiet for a long time, holding Peanut and staring at the photos spread across the table. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said finally. I don't know if I can just forget 32 years of feeling like I wasn't good enough. I'm not asking you to forget, I said. I'm asking you to let me try to do better, to let me be the grandfather Tommy deserves and the father you should have had. Before Sarah could respond, we heard footsteps on the stairs. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy from lying on his bed. Mom, are you crying? He asked, his 8-year-old face full of concern. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes. I'm okay, sweetie. Grandpa Christian and I are just talking about some grown-up things. Tommy looked at me, then at his mother, then at the photos scattered across the table. Are those pictures of my other grandparents, the ones who died? Sarah and I both froze. Neither of us had told Tommy about the adoption, but children are more perceptive than adults give them credit for. How did you know about that? Sarah asked gently. Tommy shrugged. Kids at school talk about adoption stuff sometimes. And you don't look like Grandpa Christian or Grandma Margaret. I just figured. Sarah looked at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something other than anger in her eyes. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But it was something. Would you like to see the pictures? She asked Tommy. He nodded and climbed into the chair between us. Sarah showed him the wedding photo first. This is your biological grandmother and grandfather, she said carefully. Their names were Linda and James. They died in a car accident when I was very little. Tommy studied the photo seriously. They look nice. They look like they would have been good grandparents. They would have been, I said, surprising myself by speaking. And you have another grandmother who's still alive. Your biological great-grandmother Rose. She's been waiting to meet you for your whole life. Tommy's eyes widened. Really? Can we go see her? Sarah looked at me, a question in her eyes. If your mom says it's okay, I said, we could drive up there this weekend. All 3 of us. You want to come with us? Sarah asked. If you'll let me, I said. I think it's time I learned how to be part of this family for real. Tommy clapped his hands together. Yes, can we, Mom, please? Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at her son's excited face, then at me. Okay, she said quietly. We can try. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise that everything would be fixed. But it was a chance, and that was more than I deserved. 3 months had passed since that day in Sarah's kitchen, and I was learning what it meant to be a real father and grandfather for the first time in my life. It wasn't easy. 32 years of emotional distance couldn't be undone overnight. But Sarah had agreed to try, and I was determined not to waste this second chance. Our first visit to see Rose had been overwhelming for everyone. Sarah had cried the moment she saw her biological grandmother, and Rose had sobbed so hard that nurses had come running to check on her. But watching Sarah learn about her origins Seeing her face light up as Rose told stories about Linda and James had been one of the most beautiful things I'd ever witnessed. Tommy had taken to Rose immediately, climbing into her lap within minutes of meeting her and asking 100 questions about his new great-grandma. Rose had been delighted, showing him photos and teaching him card games that Linda had loved as a child. But the real transformation had happened in the weeks that followed. Sarah and I had started talking, really talking, for the first time in decades. She'd told me about the loneliness of her childhood, about always feeling like she was auditioning for a role in our family. I'd told her about my fears, about how I'd confused protection with distance, about how much I'd loved her, even when I couldn't show it. We'd also started family therapy. Dr. Martinez was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in adoption trauma and family reconciliation. She'd helped us understand how my emotional distance had triggered Sarah's abandonment issues and how Sarah's defensive anger had reinforced my fears of rejection. Healing happens in relationship, Dr. Martinez had told us during our third session. You can't fix 32 years of hurt in isolation. You have to rebuild trust together, one moment at a time. Today was Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, we were celebrating as a real family. Sarah had invited me to have dinner at her house, and I'd spent the morning helping her cook, something I'd never done during her childhood. "Can you hand me the salt?" Sarah asked as she basted the turkey. I passed it to her, and our hands touched briefly. 6 months ago, Sarah would have pulled away immediately. Today, she just smiled and continued cooking. Tommy was in the living room, building an elaborate Lego castle that we'd been working on together for the past 2 weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I came over for dinner and stayed to help with homework or just play. It was a routine that had developed naturally, and it filled a space in my life I hadn't even realized was empty. "Grandpa Christian," Tommy called from the living room, "can you help me with the tower? It keeps falling down." "Be right there," I called back. I looked at Sarah. "Is there anything else you need help with?" "I think we're good for now," she said. "Go help him. Just try not to take over completely. He likes to figure things out himself." It was gentle guidance, the kind a daughter gives a father who's still learning how to relate to his grandson. I was grateful for it. In the living room, Tommy was frowning at a partially collapsed tower. "I don't understand why it won't stay up," he said. "I'm following the directions exactly." I sat down on the floor beside him, something that would have been unthinkable a few months ago when my pride would have kept me in my chair. "Let me see. Sometimes the directions aren't perfect." We worked together for several minutes, Tommy explaining his strategy while I offered suggestions. When the tower finally stood strong and tall, Tommy threw his arms around me in a spontaneous hug. "Thanks, Grandpa. You're really good at this stuff." I hugged him back, no longer afraid of showing affection, no longer worried about what it might mean if I loved him completely. "You're pretty good at it yourself, buddy." "Mom says you didn't used to hug much when she was little," Tommy said, with the casual honesty of an 8-year-old. "She says you were sad about something, but you didn't know how to talk about it." I glanced toward the kitchen, where Sarah was pretending not to listen to our conversation. We'd talked to Tommy about the family changes in age-appropriate ways, explaining that adults sometimes make mistakes and have to learn how to do better. "Your mom's right," I said. "I was afraid of a lot of things when she was growing up. I was afraid of loving too much and getting hurt." "That's silly," Tommy said, matter-of-factly. "Love doesn't hurt people. Mean people hurt people." Out of the mouths of babes. "You're absolutely right. I wish I'd been as smart as you when I was younger." The doorbell rang, and Tommy jumped up excitedly. "That's great-grandma Rose." We'd started picking up Rose every other weekend, bringing her to Sarah's house for family dinners. At 78, she was slowing down, but her mind was sharp, and her love for Sarah and Tommy was boundless. I opened the door to find Rose standing on the porch with a covered dish in her hands and her face glowing with happiness. She'd gained weight since we'd reconnected her with Sarah, and the sadness that had seemed to shroud her at the nursing home had lifted considerably. "Hello, Christian," she said warmly. "I brought my famous green bean casserole." "Rose, you didn't need to bring anything," I said, taking the dish from her and helping her with her coat. "You're the guest." "Nonsense. I haven't had a family to cook for in 32 years. Let me enjoy it. Tommy launched himself at Rose for one of their ritualistic hugs, and she laughed with pure joy. Watching them together, I was struck by how much love had been missing from our family for so many years, simply because I'd been too afraid to embrace it. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Rose, how are you feeling? Is your arthritis bothering you today?" The care in Sarah's voice was beautiful to hear. She'd taken to Rose immediately, hungry for the maternal love and family stories that Rose was eager to share. In the past 3 months, they'd talked on the phone twice a week and exchanged dozens of letters. "I'm feeling wonderful, dear. Couldn't be better." We gathered around Sarah's dining room table, which she'd set with her best dishes and fresh flowers from her garden. It looked like the family dinners I'd imagined having when Sarah was growing up, but had never quite managed to create. As we passed dishes around the table, Tommy chattered about school and his friends, his words peppered with "Grandpa Christian says" and "Great-Grandma Rose told me." The casual way he included all of us in his stories made my chest warm. "Grandpa Christian is teaching me how to use tools," Tommy announced as he spooned stuffing onto his plate. "We're going to build a birdhouse for Mom for Christmas." Sarah looked at me with surprise. "You're building me a birdhouse?" "Tommy's idea," I said. "He thought you'd like to watch birds from your kitchen window." "That's very thoughtful," Sarah said, and I could tell she meant it. "I'd love that." "We're going to make it blue," Tommy added. "That's Mom's favorite color." Actually, Sarah's favorite color was green, the soft sage green she'd painted her bedroom when she finally got the chance to decorate her own space. But I didn't correct Tommy. Instead, I made a mental note to suggest green paint when we got to that step. These were the details I was learning about my daughter at 67 years old. Her favorite color, how she liked her coffee, the way she hummed while she cooked. Basic things that most fathers know about their children from years of paying attention. "Rose, will you tell us more about what Sarah was like as a baby?" Tommy asked. "Mom doesn't remember much from when she was little." Rose's face lit up, and she launched into a story about how Sarah had learned to walk early because she was so determined to keep up with the neighbor's dog. As she talked, I watched Sarah's face, seeing her absorb these pieces of her history with wonder and gratitude. "Your mother Linda used to say that Sarah was fearless," Rose said. "She'd climb anything, explore everything. She had this insatiable curiosity about the world." I thought about the careful, cautious child Sarah had been in our house, always watching for approval before acting. How much of her natural spirit had I suppressed with my emotional distance? "I wish I could remember them," Sarah said quietly. "I wish I had some memory of being loved like that." "But you do remember," Rose said gently. "Not in your mind, but in your heart. The love they gave you in those first 3 years, that's still part of you. It's why you're such a wonderful mother to Tommy." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears. Healing tears. After dinner, while Sarah and Rose did dishes and shared more stories, I found myself in the backyard with Tommy, throwing a football in the fading afternoon light. It was a simple moment, the kind that probably happened in backyards all over America every day, but for me, it felt miraculous. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" Tommy said, as he threw the ball back to me. "Of course, buddy. Anything. Are you and Mom going to be okay now? Are you going to keep being our family?" The question stopped me in my tracks. This 8-year-old had been watching our reconciliation with the same careful attention Sarah had watched me with as a child, wondering if the love would last. I walked over to him and knelt down so we were eye to eye. "Tommy, I want you to know something very important. I'm going to be your grandfather for the rest of my life. No matter what happens, no matter what mistakes I make, I will always love you, and I will always be here for you. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "And Mom too?" "And your mom too. She's my daughter, and you're my grandson, and that's never going to change again." He threw his arms around me, and I held him tight, breathing in the smell of childhood and possibility. When we went back inside, Sarah was putting leftovers in containers, and Rose was organizing photos on the coffee table. "I brought some more pictures I thought you'd like to see," Rose said to Sarah. "These are from your 3rd birthday party, just 2 weeks before the accident." The photos showed a happy little girl in a pink dress surrounded by adults who were clearly devoted to her. In every picture, someone was touching her, a hand on her shoulder, arms around her waist, fingers brushing her hair. She'd been a child who was constantly embraced, constantly reassured of her place in the world. "You can see the love," Sarah said softly, touching one of the photos. "It's in every picture." "East, that's what I want for Tommy," I said, speaking before I could second-guess myself. "I want him to grow up knowing without question that he's loved. I want him to have photos like these." Sarah looked at me, and I saw something shift in her expression, a softness I hadn't seen since she was a child. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "Is it too late for me to have that?" "It's never too late," I said. "We have the rest of our lives to get it right." As the evening wound down and we prepared to drive Rose back to her facility, she pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said simply, "for bringing her back to me, for giving me the chance to know my granddaughter and great-grandson." "Thank you for forgiving me," I replied, "for not hating me for keeping her from you all these years." "We all did what we thought was best," Rose said. "The important thing is that we found each other again." Later, after Rose was settled back in her room and Tommy was asleep, Sarah and I sat on her front porch drinking coffee and watching the stars. "Do you really think we can do this?" Sarah asked. "Can we really be a family after everything that's happened?" I thought about Margaret's letter, about the love she'd seen in me that I'd been too afraid to show. I thought about Rose's stories of Linda and James, about the fearless little girl Sarah had once been. I thought about Tommy's easy affection and Sarah's cautious hope. "I think we already are," I said. "We're just learning how to do it better." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached over and took my hand. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact with me since she was a small child. "I forgive you, Dad," she said simply. "I forgive you, and I want to try." Dad, not Christian. Dad. I squeezed her hand, feeling 32 years of distance finally beginning to close. "I love you, Sarah," I said. "I've always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it." "I know," she said, "and I love you too." We sat there in comfortable silence, a father and daughter who had finally found their way back to each other, watching the stars and planning the future we should have had all along. Inside the house, my grandson slept peacefully, surrounded by photos of all the people who loved him. His mother, his grandfather, his great-grandmother Rose, and even his biological great-grandparents who had loved his mother before any of us knew she existed. He would grow up knowing he was chosen, not just accepted. He would grow up with the kind of love Sarah should have had, the kind of love I was finally learning how to give. It wasn't the family any of us had started with, but it was the family we'd built together, and that was enough.